All right, so I think that's helpful information to have as foundational as we jump into these 5 arguments. So thank you for that. So let's go ahead and get into the first one. And I think it had to do with who created God.
Okay, yes. Now, this is a question that sometimes children innocently ask just because they're curious, and it's a good question to address. But it is surprising to me how some even prominent atheists like Richard Dawkins, maybe the world's most famous atheist today. Years ago, when I read his book, The Blind Watchmaker, which that title refers to evolution. He thinks that you don't need a watchmaker to make watches, comparing this to living things. Living things are like the watch. He says, no, that appearance of design can be explained away by evolution. But before I read the book, I assumed he would marshal all these scientific arguments to make the case that evolution is fact. Instead, his book was largely one sustained argument that was more philosophical in nature, and it has to do with this question of, well, where did God come from? If God is the creator of the universe and of living things, then somebody must have made him as well. But the simple answer, in one sense, or the first thing that I want to point out in response to this question is there is a built-in assumption with the question. It's called a complex question. The assumption is that God did have a creator. So if somebody puts it just like that, who created God? I will say, well, why are you assuming that someone created God? Because the Christian doesn't believe this, right? We believe what the Bible teaches, that God is eternal. He's always been here. So nobody made him. He didn't come from anywhere. He has always existed. And notice the atheist doesn't believe that God had a creator either, because he doesn't even believe God is real. So why does the question assume God had a creator when nobody in the discussion believes that he did? But of course, what's implied, that what they're really getting at, maybe a more sophisticated questioner might ask, if the universe requires a creator, then why doesn't God? Are we just sort of being arbitrary in saying that the universe must have a cause, but God doesn't require a cause or a creator? And I would say what I've already said in my positive case for God helps to answer that challenge, because we're not claiming that everything that exists must have had a cause. Rather, things that begin to exist, those certainly require a cause. And it is clear that the universe began to exist. Even many atheists recognize this today because of things like the law of entropy, which is what I already talked about as the second law of thermodynamics. The universe is winding down, therefore it can't have existed from all eternity. So it's clear the universe must have had a cause to bring it into being. Things just don't pop into being inexplicably without a cause, right? But by contrast, Christians have always taught, the Bible has always claimed that God is eternal. And so given that, it's not obvious that he requires a cause. So there is an asymmetry between God and the universe in that respect. And one other thing to point out is I think this is intellectually satisfying, because I'm not saying that God, therefore, is just a brute fact, that he has no explanation for why he exists. There was a brilliant mathematician and philosopher from a few centuries ago named Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who was trying to wrestle with the question of why does anything exist at all? And he recognized that when we consider the things that do exist, you can distinguish between things that exist because of some external cause, and he called those things contingent, which means that their existence is not necessary. They could have not existed, right? That's a possibility. And the vast majority of things that we are familiar with are contingent things, like people and planets and mountains and computers and so forth. They might not have existed. But Leibniz says this can't be the ultimate explanation for reality. You need to ground these contingent things in something that is necessary, that just exists because of a necessity of its own nature. But it's hard to think of sort of examples of what that might be. I would say the laws of logic might be a good example of something that exists necessarily. It can't fail to exist. And Leibniz said, God also must exist in this way necessarily. And that makes sense then as a reason why he exists and is the ground for all other realities that he was free to create. And so God is necessary, but he made contingent things possible.
I think these have been very helpful principles, so thank you for that. But if someone wants to go a little bit further, wants to know more, we do have a free streaming video. I believe you have it with you here, Refuting the New Atheists. Can you tell us about it?
Well, this is an excellent lecture by one of our staff scientists, Dr. Jonathan Sarfati, who's a really brilliant, careful thinker, precise logic. And so what he does is just unpacks a number of these arguments that are made by the so-called new atheists, but these are really old arguments, and he takes them apart, point by point. And so this would be a great place to learn more if people want to follow up and to get some answers to further arguments that atheists make.
And if you want to take advantage of the free streaming video, the link is in the description. Thanks so much for your insight today, Keaton.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.